We are so excited. We're so excited to have Phil and Lisa back. So they were on last night talking about ADHD and medication, particularly, and they are incredibly kind. So they are the two of the three of the senior leadership team of ADHD 360, CEO and clinical director. I hope I've got that right. And just an extraordinary fountain of knowledge. And what they're doing around changing ADHD and diagnosis in the UK is something else. So let me bring them on. Hello, guys.
Hi. Hi, good morning.
Good morning. And you've had some sleep. Like we have not had so much sleep. You still had not much, like because you left us pretty late and you've come back pretty early. And I know the reason you've also timed this is because you've got such full days as well, and you're putting so much in. And it's a testament to you, to ADHD 360, that you're doing this. Your day job is helping people with ADHD, and in your not spare time, you're also helping people with ADHD and doing this and supporting this. It's a big deal. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and well done for seeing it through the night. I feel that I've been through the night with you, but not to the extent that you have. So congratulations on getting through the night and overcoming your technical problems and bringing the world together. I don't think there's ever been anything like this before, and it's actually a thrill and an honour to be part of this. But I have to put you on notice, Henry. If you don't get me a meeting with Adrian Childs, you will have your windows put through.
Oh gosh, this is a global threat now. This is terrible. I know, Don, in the best jest. Well, let's see what we can do. But he's a lovely man who very much wants to help make a difference, which we all do. So we're all allies in this. I need to shut up and hand over to you guys. So I'll hand over to you now.
Okay, and we're looking for about 50 minutes again, Henry. Is that okay?
That sounds exactly perfect. Okay. It's like you've done this before.
Well, who'd have thought? Welcome to Groundhog Day. Here we go, looking at diagnosis and ADHD. And I think it's really important that we talk about the diagnosis for ADHD, and we talk about it in a learned and professional way, because the truth of the matter is there's a lot of myths. There's a lot of fables and a lot of stories, not only about medicine, which we talked about last night, but also about the diagnostic process. And I think what we work with is trying to overcome stigmas of diagnosis, but also ignorance of diagnosis and diagnostic processes throughout other agencies that have not moved with the times. And Henry very kindly said that we are trying to be at the forefront, or we are at the forefront of ADHD medicine and treatment. And to get to the forefront and stay there, you've got to move with the times. You've got to be flexible and agile, and also clinically safe. And we come across a number of different things in our time. And Lisa and I, and our other co-founders, so we've got Jen Lewis-Neal, who's not with us this morning, but Jen was on the panel that wrote the NICE guidelines, NG87, and that gave us, when we started 360, a really unique insight into what went on into the writing and the passing of the guidelines, and not only what the words actually mean in the documents, but actually the meaning behind those words and what they aim and strive for. So I think what we'd like to talk about today is some of those things. And if we talk about, I think we've set our stall out to talk about the NHS and why we're in the position we are in the UK with NHS services. And let's not be critical of our NHS. Let's be supportive, but recognise the challenges they've got, and why there's a place for private diagnostics. And then move into right to choose and what that's all about in England, but also look at the ages for diagnosis and why there are lower levels of age limits and what they mean. And I think if we were to talk through those things, Lisa, that would give us a good smattering of what we feel are the inbound inquiries that we have throughout time. Would that be fair?
Yeah, absolutely.
So let's talk about the NHS. Lisa and I started working on this 20 years ago, didn't we? And
Yeah.
you were running the UK nurse network, and bringing nurses really into ADHD, which had been the kind of sole ground of psychiatrists and paediatricians. And of course, over 20 years, we've seen that massive change into nurses becoming experts in ADHD. Let's just talk about that for a second. Let's not lose the power of that and the work that you did 20 years ago with nursing. What was that change, and how did that come about in terms of the diagnostic process?
I think when I started in ADHD in 2002, it was very much a consultant medical lead. And then, fortunately, the NICE guidance prior to 2018 changed the wording of who could diagnose and treat ADHD. And it didn't say doctor, it said suitably qualified clinician. So that opened the gateway for clinicians like myself to really take a lead in ADHD. But it was, I think it's fair to say, quite a slow process in bringing that change forward, and also still working in quite old-fashioned systems, and systems that don't like change, or they don't like change quickly. So it was very much driven by nurses going into schools and observing children, whilst also assessing them in clinic, treating them and titrating them, but in a world where appointments were probably not as often as they are for us. So maybe, 6 weekly appointments, 3 monthly appointments, where optimization was quite difficult. And I think it's fair to say that we've blown that out of the water, really, and how we do ADHD. But it was a very slow process back in 2002 to get a diagnosis. It might take 3 to 6 months to actually get to the diagnostic part, which is a lifetime for a child who's 7, 8 or 9, and actually the referral for those children were a lot older than they are now. So I was seeing teenagers and who appeared beyond reach because they'd missed so much, and trying to change and help those teenagers was almost impossible. So it feels like the dark ages now when I talk about that way of working, and we've come a long way, I think.
And if we accept that in making that change 2002 thereabouts and opening the market up, what we've also seen is that growth in social media, and that massive change in media profile of ADHD from being something that was swept under the carpet, naughty boys, and we've seen it go through the it's not naughty boys into girls and women, and then into adults as well over our 20 years of working in this. And we've seen this mushroom that's grown and grown and grown and grown. And of course, as you've indicated, our funding of the NHS hasn't grown in parallel with the awareness and the acute awareness of ADHD in all of those age groups. And there you are in 2002, taking the lead from the paediatricians and the psychiatrists who were swamped with overall mental health, and starting that nuance of a special diagnostic clinic and a diagnostic process for ADHD, and it being under-resourced still. But we've got the growing mushroom, less resources, and some pretty archaic processes. You alluded to the most contentious there in the diagnostic process, and that'll be how nurses were sent to schools to assess people in the classroom. And that was, for me, when we look back historically, that use of a nurse to do that, to perform that function, was a goodwill gesture for the diagnostic process that actually wasn't required anywhere in the diagnostic process. and has become the urban norm that you must be assessed in the classroom, and you must have. In fact, we know of psychologists and psychiatrists who still insist on going to the classroom because that's the way it happened in 2002. And I think it's a great thing to clear up right at the outset that within the diagnostic process, you absolutely don't need to do that. And we work really hard with that, what NICE says and what the DSM says. And what they say is, of course, you know where I'm going now, Lisa, is that evidence of impairment in a setting other than the primary setting that we're talking about. So if the primary setting is home, we would need evidence of a second setting to prove that this isn't the home that is causing the impairment, that it's actually crossing over different boundaries. It may well be that the school are making that referral because they've got concerns about the impairment for the child. And we need evidence of the second setting, which may well be home or another club setting or scouts or something like that. And you know, talk for a second about the richness of where that second setting evidence can come from, Lisa, where it doesn't have to involve a clinical professional sat for a whole day or half a day in a school watching a child that we know has got impairment.
I mean, we can get information from school, and we often do get information from school, but that could be in a school report, for example, or behaviour logs or detention logs, or, you know, parents get lots of information from school, and in our system they can upload as much information as they like, and they do. So it doesn't need to be us physically going in and observing that child in that setting, but gathering that written information is really important. But a second setting can be absolutely anywhere. A social setting, so another home, i.e. a grandparent's home, for example, where they might go for a sleepover, so they're in a completely different environment with a different set of rules. It could be the brownie leader or the cub leader, or the swimming teacher's a really good one, because if you don't follow rules in the swimming pool, then you can die. So swimming teachers are really hot on saying, you know, little Johnny can't come swimming anymore. So, you know, getting a snap questionnaire completed by the swimming teacher is a second setting. So it doesn't need to be school. And indeed, a lot of children, and I know this from assessing adults, a lot of kids mask in school. So depending on their personality type and the teacher and the school environment, they can often mask all day in school and not display much of their ADHD symptoms, because they would rather not be in school than demonstrate that behaviour and be embarrassed in front of the peers, or be shouted at by the teacher, or be given a detention for not sitting still. So you could equally miss a child who you went to observe in school because they were masking. And we know from experience that often leads to depression and anxiety in adults. So I think it's important that we explore what the second setting looked like. And then in lockdown, for example, where would you go there? Do you not diagnose someone because they're not in a school environment, or our homeschooled children? You know, do you not diagnose those children because they don't actually attend school? Absolutely not. You find a way of gaining that evidence somewhere else, and it's doable.
And I think that's really important, that when we had COVID, and we grew our business and saw a lot more people through COVID, and still are, because a classic interpretation of that second setting needing to be an assessment at school, and for 2 years kids weren't at school, closed down services. It wasn't the sole reason, but it was one of the reasons. And being at the forefront of interpretation and the forefront of analysis of actual child's behaviour, we were able to continue. And it's really important that we when we talk about the diagnosis of ADHD, we bust the myth, and I think you've done that succinctly there, Lisa. And of course, a homeschool child maybe being homeschooled because they're struggling to fit into the school setting, and are struggling to be the best person they can be in an environment that doesn't encourage, doesn't respect their ADHD. We were on last night with Henry and his team, and just before then I was on a conference call with a mum whose son has been trying to get an ADHD diagnosis, assessment and diagnosis from the local services in the NHS, and been refused. And every day has to go and sit under a weighted blanket in the deputy head's office because the child is no longer able to cope in school. And every day they're in that class, that non-classroom, learning nothing, sitting under a weighted blanket, trying to control behaviour, and can't get an autism or an ADHD assessment. And I'm just thinking, well, crikey, what the hell's going on here? When we've got that level of evidence. So schools, second setting, completely different. You talked there about SNAP and SNAP4, and I think that introduces screening and the purpose of screening. And in medicine, we see screening as a really common approach to things, don't we? So, for instance, somebody may have their blood pressure taken at their GP, and that may screen them for other issues and other potential healthcare issues. And we screen using, for children, we use the SNAP4 that you mentioned, and for adults we use the ASRS and SNAP4. Jim Swanson and his chums over in America produced this amazing questionnaire and then had it validated globally, that what it did was discern by 26 questions, in fact 18 relating to ADHD and 8 relating to oppositional behaviour, that if the answers to those 18 questions fell into a certain numerical category, score, if you will, I don't like the word score, I prefer results. If your screening results were of this magnitude, that would be a positive screen for ADHD and worthy continuing on the diagnostic journey. So it's a screen, to screen in and screen out. Now, similarly, the ASRS has 18 questions, and that does a similar job. Now, when we run the academy, Lisa, when we talk about the ASRS in particular, and that's published by the World Health Organization, its provenance is quite incredible. There's statistics that back up what a positive screen can mean for an onward diagnosis of ADHD, and just hit people with those numbers so we can understand the importance of an accurate screen in the diagnostic process. And then I'm going to pick up why we screen so much.
Yeah. So in the ASRS questionnaire, for example, so it's validated and it's used in clinical trials. And there's, as Phil's alluded to, there's 18 statements which are based around the 18 DSM criteria. But the first 6 statements, if you score 4 or more in the first 6 statements, that's classed as a positive screen. And it's 90% accurate. So if you screen positive in the ASRS screening tool and you go on to have an assessment for ADHD, then there's a 90% chance of you receiving a diagnosis of ADHD. Now, those 6 question statements take about 15 seconds to complete, which I think is pretty incredible for 6 statements to be so accurate. But it is accurate, and it's what we use as our screening tool, and will you also use that moving forward to see where the patient is in terms of optimization?
Indeed. So the point we're making there in terms of the diagnostic journey, the treatment pathway for a patient, is that we will use screening tools that are internationally validated. We don't write our own, we don't do our own thing. We use internationally validated tools, and any clinician should, as a specialist, use validated tools. And that can accelerate the journey. And it can actually mean that we can crack on with other evidence, medical history, mental health history, setting goals, mood questionnaire, sleep questionnaire, looking at all of those parameters that we look at. And we do it prior to engaging with the patient, so it's all done online, so that when the patient gets to see a clinician, the purpose is to reinforce all of the information that's been gathered thus far and triaged by that specialist, and we're ready to go into an assessment that is wanting nothing other than that interaction between 2 people, a clinician and a patient, and to move forward in the diagnostic process. Now, that gives me the opportunity to talk about the diagnostic process, doesn't it, Lisa, in terms of the way that we conduct that. whether it's face-to-face or on Skype, it does not matter. And we've worked hard with European and American colleagues to build protocols for Skype, and it actually works really, really well. There's two things going on. The first thing is that we follow, and a clinician should follow, a semi-structured interview, ascertaining any levels of impairment, what they are, and what the characteristics are in relation to ADHD. And the reason that it's semi-structured is that structure should follow and gather the evidence of the DSM, the manual, the international manual. I mentioned it last night, the book that's so thick that hardly anyone can afford it. And by having a semi-structured interview that follows a clinical pathway, when you get to the end of it, you know whether or not there is sufficient impairment and sufficient evidence to warrant a diagnosis. But the second and more important thing that's going on throughout that whole process, and this is why things are done on Skype or face-to-face, they're not done on the telephone, is because your trained and skilled clinician is looking at you, watching you and observing you, the clinical expression. And those clinical observations are hugely important to the evidence gathering to lead to the diagnosis. So your diagnosis process goes from all of the evidence gathering of all of the mundane stuff, let's call it, sleep hygiene, sleep problems, mood, where are we with mood, the screening tool, your medical history, your mental health history, what other ailments have you had, what hospital visits have you had. There's also a risk assessment, making sure that we're okay to crack on. And that's part one. Part two is the triage of that, to make sure that when we go to assessment that we're doing the right thing for that patient. And then the third thing is the assessment with that massive dollop of assessment observation, clinical observation taking place at the same time. If we wind that back, the one thing we should remember is that the assessment, whether it's for a child or an adult, can be emotionally traumatic. Because what we're encouraging, a good assessor is not ticking boxes on a form. And a good assessor gets underneath what's going on in life for that person and really starts to unlock some of the things. You talked about masking before, kids masking at school. A good assessor gets underneath what the coping mechanisms have prevented other people seeing for a while, but the individual has suffered within themselves, and unlocks quite a lot of emotional baggage, for want of a word, and emotional trauma. And the skill is to get that out so that we know exactly what we're dealing with, and then be able to put that back together at the end when we come around to the treatment pathway and sorting out treatment. Talk to us for a second, Lisa, about the journey that a patient goes on when going through their assessment with you and our clinical colleagues, and what that means to them when we get to that end point.
I think what's interesting when you work across the ages, you get really rich information from your adult patients. And they often tell us that we are the first person in their life who understands them. And so they've had a good hour being asked questions that resonate and make sense. And they almost feel like we've been stalking them, or we've literally opened up the brain and it can see their story. And I find that really sad, that I'm the first person that's understood this 45-year-old adult. But that is often the case. But what you can do in that conclusion is allow them to feel that they trust you, because you do know them, so they then trust the treatment pathway that you are recommending to them and why. And it's a really powerful process. And also we do, obviously, as an assessment, we're focusing on the difficulties around ADHD, because without those difficulties, then you can't receive a diagnosis. Without impairment, you can't receive a diagnosis. But then I also see it as my opportunity to talk about the positives of ADHD and how ADHD can be a gift. So although in the assessment we're focusing on, what's the struggle, it also gives me that opportunity because of that richness of information and that prep, so I know what job they do and the story, to actually then embrace the positives of their ADHD and how that can be helpful in the future. So it's a real, you know, it is quite powerful to be in that position.
And done properly, with all of that prep by the patient and by the clinician, that triage, that structured assessment with those observations, that building of rapport, that building of trust, that emotional bond between the two. We are mainly and ready to go straight to treatment when we've got that diagnostic process confirmed, aren't we? And we move forward for the validated patients, and we get that expression quite a lot, that I feel validated, that I've had these struggles and people have struggled to understand me and I've struggled to understand myself, and now I feel validated. And one's only got to look at our Trustpilot reviews for how often the word validated is actually used. I've just had a flag from Henry in the messaging system to say if there are any questions, we're going to switch to Q&A in about 10 minutes. And Henry's going to pull some questions out and ask us them in about 10 minutes. So if you've got any questions, submit them through the QA section of the portal, which is globaladhd.com. Now, we talked earlier about NHS swamped from 2002, from the get-go, really, when services really became alive, and funding, unfortunately, not. And it's very easy to drop into criticism of this. And that's not our job. Our job is to try and work alongside the NHS and work with the NHS, and accept that if you have a budget and you're the commissioner and you've got to work out where that budget goes, you're now playing decision maker on who gets care. And there will always be more important ailments and more important illnesses that demand some of that cash, some of that money. And at the same time, there's always controls over how much the NHS can have budget-wise. So if we just accept that commissioners have a very difficult job and they can commission what they can commission and they can't commission other things, without being critical, we accept, therefore, that there is a constraint on what the NHS can do. Step in private services to help. And what we've tried to do, and I'm sure there are others, is create a very affordable service that supplements the national provision in an affordable way that can help people. So if your child is coming up to switching school from junior school to high school, that tipping point, that's important. If you're going to have to wait 3 years, you're 3 years into high school, you start working on GCSEs, let's get on with it. Let's spend 900 quid and get on with it. And it sounds flippant to say that, but it's worth doing. It's similar on that run up to GCSEs, or an adult about to lose their job or lose their relationship, or abusing substances and having a really tough time. And what we've got, the private sector has a responsibility, is to not be someone that sits in a fat cat office, seeing one person a week at £3,500 and rocking up in a Lamborghini. There's a responsibility for the private sector to support the National Health Service by taking some of that pressure off, so that the fundamental cases that can be seen swiftly through private can be moved on their patient journey, and then hopefully switch back into the NHS through sharing care with the GP, so that the patient can move into an NHS funded treatment pathway. And I know, Lisa, you work really hard with the communication with GPs to make sure we can shoehorn people back into that national process at an appropriate time. And that greater good is part of our pathway, isn't it? And, you know, I'd like you to just talk about the values we have right from the get-go when we were in Warrington choosing the colour palette for our brand. Do you remember? And you said to me, can we not do this for nothing, Phil? Do you remember? And
not a good businesswoman.
when I picked myself up off the floor and said, "Oh, we're supposed to get a living out of that." But talk about what we do and what can. It's not about 360 this. It's about what can be done in the private sector to support that national journey, that national good, isn't it?
Yeah. As I say, I'm not a businesswoman. I think a caveat to that. Well, can we not do some of it for free? And to be fair, we couldn't really work out how to do that and be fair. So what we did decide is that we'd have a range of packages of care. Now, we have a silver package, which we offer to our patients who are on universal credit, because what Phil and I wanted was to be accessible to everyone, regardless of income. So we don't make any money on that package. But what it does allow patients to do is afford what I think is the best care. So we offer a significant discount. We also offer a payment plan, so they can fund their treatment over 10 months at £58 over 10 months. And but the standard of care is no different to the gold package. So the silver package patients evidence their level of benefit and receive a significant discount, but receive the same care as someone on the gold package. And I think that's something that Phil and I are quite passionate about, that just because you don't have loads of cash floating around, you shouldn't have a substandard set of care. And I'm quite proud of that. And I don't actually know the numbers, the percentages of how many we have on silver package, but it's a fair few. And I think our patients appreciate it, and we make it work. You know, we have very few patients who go, no, I can't afford that, or I'm not prepared to fund that, you know. And then we have a platinum package, which is for our very complex patients, and that's a separate entity. But the gold and the silver package are identical. The only difference is how much the patient pays for the silver package.
And that greater good is where private sector can support the National Health Service and take some pressure off those services that, as we talked about, have grown since 2002 and spun out of control, because demand has always been there but never recognised. And now that demand is recognised, government spending can't keep up with that demand. So there has to be some support from the private sector for that national good, and proudly we provide that. Now, the next thing to spin into in the closing kind of 6 minutes is this great big beast of right to choose and the diagnostic process. And you know, it's worth just picking that apart for a second. That we've been approached by 5 or 6 NHS trusts, and I'm going to put this out there: if anybody from a trust is listening, or anybody wants to influence the trusts, we can take on more in terms of NHS work, and we can do more to support the NHS. That's our commitment to the national ADHD good, especially with children. The trusts can commission us, and we will provide these services that we're talking about. And once you become a provider for the NHS, so let's say our Lincolnshire contract, once we have satisfied the contractual requirements to provide that service to the Lincolnshire Commissioner, we are then providing services to the NHS, not just the parochial geography of Lincoln, to the whole of the NHS. And that allows anybody to come to us under their right to choose, their choice profile, can come to us and become a patient under the NHS, because we are a provider of services to the NHS. And once that happened for us as a service in terms of that diagnosis, well, the world just went balmy. And we were getting 30 to 40 referrals through GPs a day. And for some NHS clinics, that's 2 months of a clinic capacity, and we were getting that a day. And we've staffed up, trained up, and gone through the pain of growth and, you know, sort of whatever, to be able to try and meet that demand. And we are meeting that demand a lot better now, because we weren't ready for 30 or 40 a day. We just weren't. Nobody could have been. But what we've not done is change the diagnostic process. No. So we've got the big numbers, and we've had to grow the back office, and we're going through a recruitment campaign right now for our back office staff. I think one of the pain points of being in rural Lincolnshire is finding the right staff for the back office when most of Lincolnshire is covered in potatoes, leeks and cabbages. And we, you know, so the central Manchester, central London, we find staff for fun. In Lincolnshire, it's proven difficult, but we're growing the back office to be able to service the need of growing more clinicians, to service that need of right to choose. But the diagnostic process doesn't change everything is the same, but the tab is picked up by the NHS. We have a bit of a weight on that because 30 or 40 a day. But the important thing here is that you can go for an ADHD diagnosis, both privately and through the state, through the NHS. And the process should be no different. The process should be agile. It should be getting you from a position of risk. An untreated ADHD is a position of risk, and it should get you into services and into treatment medically as quick as humanly possible. And if a service can do that, we are adequately managing risk on behalf of the national good. And that's what Lisa and I have set out to do right from the very get-go, is to be part of something that is part of the national good. And Lisa, as well as saying, can we not do this for nothing, also beats me up every month saying, can we not pay ourselves more? Well, no, we can't, because we have to pay other people to actually to deliver this service.
Got a child at university. I need a parent.
Me too. And you know, we've now got 60 staff providing this provision at these rates that are affordable. And we said right from the get-go, if somebody's on their backside financially, and that's normally generational because of the generation flow for ADHD, if someone's on their backside, we should be able to provide a service that costs less than a Starbucks every day, and provide a service that diagnostically is 100% safe and sound, but it costs less than a Sky package. And then the decision for the family is, do you want Sky or do you want a well child? And that, you know, those kind of decisions become quite straightforward then. So that's the diagnosis process. You've got to round that off. You should have a very swift and agile process that can manage risk very quickly and get that patient into treatment as soon as humanly possible. And for us, for a child, that's within a week or 10 days. For an adult, it can be about 2 months, 3 months with the waiting list, which is coming down as we recruit more. And once you've been assessed and you've been diagnosed, you should move straight into treatment. And there should be no waiting time between those two, because we know where we are, we know what we're at, and we know what we need to do. So you've got all of your prep, patient and clinician, triage by the clinician. You've then got a risk assessment. You've got a diagnostic process linked to the international manual, which is accompanied by a huge skill set of clinical observations to make sure we can see the ADHD. We don't need to go to school. We gather that evidence from elsewhere, from school, from clubs, from grandparents, and those other things when we're talking about children. And then we can move into treatment. And as the clock ticks into the last minute, the guidelines say that you are looking for the age of 5 or 6 to start your process off and look at children. Reality says, if you've got a child at 4 that's at extreme risk because of their hyperactivity or impulsive behaviour, you cannot afford to wait for their birthday to start looking at them and treating them. So in terms of any mum or dad, grandparents, or primary school, pre-primary, prep school, nursery school teacher who's got a child at the age of 4 or 5 who's demonstrating such risk, and we've had them. We've had children in hospital because of the injuries they're getting because of their risk-taking behaviour. We've had children who cannot possibly have their best life because of their behaviours, because of their impulsivity and their hyperactivity. Do not wait for that clock to get to 6. Get to a service that can help you. And the only reason that medicine starts at the age of 6 is about the controls that were placed on the clinical trials for that medicine. The medicines are not unsafe beneath that. You don't get to 6 and all of a sudden medicine becomes safe for you. And similarly, when you get to 16 or 18, medicines that are licensed for children only do not stop working on an adult. That's just pharmacology nonsense in the background. And the skill of the clinic, the skill of the clinician and the nurse, the pharmacist, the team that work together, the GP, the skill of that person is to understand the medicine so you can be treated through that diagnostic process. So it's important we see it as a supply chain. Literally, it's a chain of events that need to happen fluidly, quickly, to manage risk for the patient. And if you're under 6, don't worry about it. Just contact someone and get on with it. And if you get into 18, 19, and you're switching into being an adult service, then the medicine doesn't stop, shouldn't stop, and won't stop. And that whole diagnostic process folds together to manage risk. Henry, welcome back.
Honestly, like listening to you guys, it's been amazing. I have to say, also slightly heartbreaking. Like it's there's, like talking about the challenges in the NHS. I think I know that I have absolutely the private sector and the NHS have always worked hand in hand. I think we've had this discussion before. Like, when you go in an X-ray machine, it's not NHS, it's Siemens. Like every single GP surgery is a private practice. Like it doesn't matter. Like healthcare is what matters. Like this philosophy that it's overarching philosophy, I think can really get in the way. And I think you do a good job of managing, because that's what you're going to do. Lisa, when you talked about kids like masking in school, like, I mean, the amount, and particularly what made me, and it's going to actually amazingly segue to our first question, was girls. Like, we know girls' ADHD manifests slightly differently, and then masks slightly differently, and that girls are better at masking. And we've had people talk about the Coke bottle analogy, that a kid masks at school, and they get shaken up, and then when they come home, it's and actually, as an adult, I know when I'm in those situations where I've got to be really formal and look, the suit can only do so much. And I try, and God, it's hard work. But you actually saying that's going to help so many people. I can't underline how important that's going to be. What is the lose it line, Lisa? First question from an anonymous caller called Phil.
So I described the lose it line. I'm just going to do a quick diagram. So my patients, I don't know whether you can see this.
Yeah, we can.
So this line here is the lose it line.
Oh, wow.
Okay, and so my patients are hovering just below the lose it line, and they look normal. They look like you or I, and you wouldn't think they were bubbling below that line. So people will say to me, "Oh yeah, they went from 0 to 100 like that," and I go, "Actually, no. They've been at 99 all day, and then one little thing happens, and it's usually when they're coming out of school, and the mum might say the wrong thing to them, or another child pushes them, and they just explode." And so, the treatment for ADHD will bring that child from that lose it line down, so that if you're functioning at this level and you have a little blip, we're not near this lose it line. And that describes a lot of children, and the masking is so key to why diagnosis is missed, and why I'm seeing far too many adults who should have been picked up as children, and it leads to a lot of that anxiety, low mood.
Well, we have that. Actually, wait, look. Well, let's do that. Segue to that question. Obviously, we see anxiety and depression so commonly, and you gave some statistics earlier, which are very, very powerful. And actually, one of the things, one of the things that I found so powerful about both of you. So, as a charity, as an individual, also one of the great battles is describing ADHD and the detail of ADHD and communicating it. And something you both have in absolute spades, things like the lose it line and other, I've been watching it, noting it a lot. You have these worked up communications that you've clearly put enormous thought on, which provide this wonderful point of clarity for people. They're so hard to come up with. And when they're seen, they look really obvious. The lose it line looks really obvious. And I think some of the best things, when they're put in front of you, you're like, well, that's just obvious, because it's so good, and it's spectacular. Obviously, it's been a long night. Have ADHD. My ADHD exacerbates. And I can see, for people, these are my notes of attempted things. It's chaos. That's what I managed to write down. The brain is even further around. So probably best to, right, the question on anxiety, and then we need to do, there's a big question about ADHD in women, which we've got to promise to people on. But we see a lot of people with anxiety, and someone just simply asked, like, what medication recommendation do you have? Like, what's your thought process on that? Like a disclaimer here: no official medical advice is not a thing. Like, etc. Right, back to you.
So a lot of our patients are diagnosed with depression, anxiety, or both, and they're already treated for their anxiety and depression. And funnily enough, it's not working very well. Now, treatment for depression and anxiety is working on the serotonin chemical, and in ADHD you've got a deficit in dopamine. So if you were to treat someone's serotonin chemical when they don't have a problem with serotonin, then you're going to raise the serotonin level and probably end up with side effects. So you end up with treatment resistant depression and anxiety. Well, Phil and I talk about situationally cheesed off patients who have depression and anxiety because of their untreated ADHD. They don't have a serotonin imbalance, they have a dopamine imbalance because they've got untreated ADHD. Now, 75% of my adult patients come with a diagnosis of depression, anxiety, or both. If they've got ADHD and I treat them, 90% of those will not be depressed or anxious anymore. Now, if they're already on a treatment for depression and anxiety, I don't ask them to stop. I say stay on it. Now, there is a very, very rare risk of serotonin syndrome if you give someone a medicine that can also slightly raise the serotonin level. But we look for that. So it doesn't stop us prescribing when someone's on an antidepressant. But we look for that serotonin syndrome. They've got a blood pressure monitor that we provide. We ask them to do the blood pressure and pulse daily. If the blood pressure and pulse goes up significantly, you stop your ADHD meds, you let us know. I've seen serotonin syndrome once in 20 years, so it's not going to stop me prescribing for their ADHD, but let's look for the serotonin syndrome. So my advice would be to treat their ADHD, even if they've got anxiety in them, and optimize that treatment so we get their ADHD as on point as possible. And if they still have a resistant depression or anxiety, and some patients can have ADHD, depression, anxiety that need treatment in their own right, then let's treat that. But 90% of the time, it's actually ADHD, and treat that ADHD, and you'll treat your anxiety alone.
Thank you. That's important. I think, and it's just. As you said, like, do you want to remind what was the percentage of people you thought come through have anxiety, depression?
5% come with anxiety, depression, or both.
Yeah. So
90% of them are not anxious or depressed once we've optimised their ADHD.
Darren, you'll make me cry. Like, seriously, like, it's been long, but like, gosh, it's so
Which
important.
Is why we're trying to train GPs that if they have this treatment-resistant anxiety and depression, just do that ASRS questionnaire that takes about 15 seconds, because actually you could be missing something that's key and you can treat.
Henry, there's a paper on our website, and we've labelled it SPO, which is situationally off, which describes.
We are allowed to swear. I don't know if you watched the Hairston one. Like,
well, yeah.
We don't have broadcast rules here. We're not going to get told off by Ofcom.
Heston's got a clinical reason to be able to swear.
Except it was me who started it. But I did it purposely. Obviously, I wanted him to be relaxed.
Well, there's a paper all about that anxiety and depression and how that builds up. And our research says from the age of 6, people can remember an anchor back in their life. That's when it all started to go belly up, when you weren't mixing with friends, you weren't invited to parties, you weren't the person who was being invited to sleepovers, you were marginalised by friends, school, and so on. And you do become pissed off, and you get, so we won't labour on it because you want to move to women, and we've only got 5 minutes left.
Well, we'll run until the a little long because it's too important. Well done, this person who put this question At last night's ADHD 360 session, you said you would speak more in your 7-day session about treating women with ADHD medication differently to support their menstrual cycle. How do you treat women who are going through, and actually I think, could you ask, because I would like, they've asked about going through the perimenopause. The hormonal experience seems to enhance the impacts of ADHD. How can women be empowered to manage their own medication to correlate with the rapid changing hormonal landscape? And how does HRT interact with this? And I'd also like to know about girls going through puberty. We'll overrun, whatever you need. It's too important a topic, but over to you.
So we actually do something. So we optimise our patients, and we're very passionate about that. But then Phil and I coined the phrase situational optimization. So what does that mean? So if I've got a patient who, and they usually do tell me on assessment that they have certain weeks of the month that their ADHD seems to be worse than others, and so I bank that comment, and then I optimize their treatment as normal as I would do any other patient. And when I think I've got them to as optimized as I can possibly get them, I will ask them the question, do you feel optimized the whole month? Or is there a week in the month where actually you feel like your ADHD meds are not working as well as they could be? And it's usually the week before the period. So if the answer to that question is yes, actually there's 1 week where I feel like I've not taken my meds, or they're not doing what they should be doing, or they're not doing what they do the rest of the month, then what I do is I slightly increase the dose of medicine that week. And so so for example, I might optimize them on 50 milligrams of Elvance. So the week before I might increase them to 70 milligrams, so they have 1 week at 70 milligrams and 3 weeks at 50 milligrams. And trust me, they know when that week's coming because the medicine's just not doing it. And then we do shared care on 1 week at 70 milligrams and 3 weeks at 50 milligrams. So that's how we situationally optimize our patients. And it's not every woman, and not every woman has issues with premenstrual symptoms. So I would say it's probably less than 5% of my female patients who need this situational optimization. But like we said last night, if we don't get every week optimized, that's a quarter of a lady's life that's not on point. And in my book, that's not okay for a quarter of your life to be suboptimal. So it's fairly simple, but not many people are doing it. It's almost like, well, we've got you optimized, that's good enough, go away, we'll do shared care, and you'll just have to have a really tricky week. And Phil and I don't think that that's acceptable.
Henry, if I can jump in there, to move the discussion on, because it's easy to talk about and think about a woman having a menstrual cycle as that kind of 25, 30-year-old woman running a home and struggling with everything. And that's almost a classic cartoon image. But actually, this starts from the age of 10, 11, 12, doesn't it, with girls in society these days who start to actually reach puberty early. And so this is actually a paediatric issue as much as it's an adult care issue. And that is definitely being missed on how we can help a young girl get through school for 4 weeks of the month, not just 3. And we train and we focus really hard on catching that. And those are not easy conversations to have with a child patient. They're really not. And but the conversations that need to be had. And when that we go back to that assessment process, gaining that trust and that confidence in the clinician allows us and permits us to start having those conversations. And then your question from the contributor moves that conversation into perimenopause and menopause for a woman when life gets really bloody tough. And if you look at the menopause symptoms, they in a lot of things they mirror ADHD symptoms, and that becomes tricky when you get to that kind of 45 to 50, 60-year-old lady who's now demonstrating symptoms that at a time of her life when she needs sensitivity and help, can put pressure on a relationship. And what we've got to be able to do is unpick whether that's the menopause or whether it's ADHD that wasn't caught before and now it's exacerbated by the menopause, or whether or not we've got someone in treatment and now that we can see the classic signs of the menopause, it's as if the ADHD has got worse. In fact, it hasn't, but what we've got is other hormonal situations going on that make ADHD seem worse. But then again, we revisit the treatment plan, and that's the important part, is that when we've got an adult on a treatment plan, we have to come back to review regularly. And that review goes back to a screening tool, goes back to a structured conversation, and we start to think about what else could be going on at this person's stage in life. And that review should be designed for a woman to start talking about the menopause and the perimenopause and what do we need to do with medicine to change that. And one of our senior clinicians, Rebecca Whelan, is currently focused on studying the living daylights out of the menopause so that we can actually become national experts on this. Because what a lot of people do is study it and say there's a problem. What doesn't happen a lot is, and here's the solution. And that's the same with puberty and the menstrual cycle. There was a lot of research out there saying, yeah, I'm a woman and for 1 week of a month I'm not as sharp as I would be with my ADHD because I'm a woman and my menstrual, but nobody's bloody doing anything. So, you know, we cracked it for the menstrual cycle and we're in the process of cracking it for the menopause. And frankly, as a middle-aged man, I genuinely believe women deserve this. And we talk about the difference between women and men in ADHD symptoms. That's not the argument we need to be talking about these days. The argument we need to be talking about is giving adequate care and treatment for women so that they actually have their best life, not a life that some man has designed 20 years ago in terms of a clinical process. And you can probably tell I'm quite passionate about this, because this is the journey that clinical practice and diagnosis and assessment and treatment should be providing now, is the argument of how women present slightly differently to men. It's actually not as profound as people say. Girls have been missed because we were looking for naughty boys, and we were looking for naughty boys alone. And 20 years ago, Lisa and I started banging the drum. It's not about naughty boys. It's about everybody who's got those impairments. And there was a lady with me yesterday in a leadership course I'm running here in London who said, I've not got ADHD, I've got ADD. I said, well, that doesn't exist. So what's really going on? And she said, well, I don't know. I've just got this. I've been told I've got ADD. I said, so if your brain is a computer and you've got 20 programs open and you're tabbing between each program constantly, how do you manage to write the letter in Word when you visit it once every 20 concentration cycles? And she said, yeah, that's me. That's my ADHD. Well, that's no different to a lad with ADHD. It's just been missed because it's not physical hyperactivity. And that's all we were looking for 20 years ago. And we have to shift our lens to become people that do things about it, not just talk about it.
Yeah, and I agree, that change of lens. So all kids, regardless of gender, if they're predominantly inattentive, if they're not showing that troublemaking, that we have a more sophisticated tools to we pick everyone up, and I think that's exactly right. Which is, like, with your permission, run a couple of minutes over, just because there's a number of people have written a very similar question, and I think one half you know the absolute answer for, and the other would be good to know. And it's I'm going to summarise them both. So it's people talking about the problem of private assessments and GPs, NHS GPs taking them on as shared care. One of the parts of concern is that as a private provider to the NHS does shared care, like the shared care relationship there, and the other is as a private provider. So when you're doing a private assessment, how then shared care with an NHS provider can help. And a person is talking about that in their area. GPs have been instructed not to do private shared care. I just wonder if you'd be able to say a few words on that.
This is the biggest bone of contention in UK healthcare, I think, is the freedom that GPs have and the way that the whole structure between private healthcare and NHS healthcare and shared care, as it's called, is constructed. It's wrong. It's fundamentally flawed. Now, there's a number of things in there. First of all, you said before, Henry, every GP practice is a private practice. So we're not actually talking NHS and private. We're talking private and private. And the primary care, the GP world doesn't like to hear that argument, but that's the facts. We're dealing with private and private. So let's take away that layer. Let's take away that fundamental misbelief. The fact that we're an NHS provider means that we're not talking private and private. We're talking NHS to private, and those standards are exactly the same. So we're busting myths, and we're having to have some very difficult conversations. The first thing I would say to anybody who's struggling for shared care is you are covered by the Equalities Act. 2010 Equalities Act, you have a disability under that legislation by having your ADHD, and every decision that a public servant, a GP, makes in relation to you and your disability has to be qualified under the Equalities Act. Now that's a powerful tool to bring about some rethinking. Now we've tried it, we've been there, we've done it. The better tool is to work with your clinical provider and gain the confidence and trust of the GP. And in doing that, your GP, we have brought many GPs into shared care with us because they actually can see what we're doing and trust and work with us. There's also an emerging national guideline to shared care, because at the moment it's a postcode lottery, and that shouldn't be the case either. So there's an emerging national shared care guideline coming out, but guess what? It's got no teeth. It's a tiger that sucks the blood out of something as opposed to biting it, because GPs don't have to adhere to it. So what's the blooming point of having a national shared care policy? But it's emerging, and the next thing to push with primary care is that there's actually an adherence to this national thing. So it's actually not a private NHS thing. There's as many GPs won't share care with an NHS provider than they would do with the private sector. This is the biggest pickle jar that we've got in medicine at the moment, is that the GPs are overworked, overswamped, can't do this, can't do that. Yeah, you can't. So actually, push the services away from and just come back for shared care. And actually, it needs a big strategic push. And I think that's one of the things we've talked about, Henry, is how can a charity like ADHD UK work with the biggest provider in the UK, us, to actually lobby for change at the highest level to make sure that this problem of shared care is managed more effectively.
And the core point, which is very, very sound, is that GPs do have this discretion, and some of them are declining, and they can decline. I think, as you said, both an NHS provider as well as a private provider, and it's a huge sadness. We do have to call it there. We've overrun because you're just too damn interesting and insightful and knowledgeable, both of you. It's your own fault. I wanted to touch on before we sign up. One of the things I do think is deeply impressive about. There's a lot deeply impressive about ADHD 360, but one of the things is the way you price and model, and you have very clear packages so people can know exactly what they're getting, and it covers the 12-month period, so people can know. With some other providers who remain nameless, they kind of get you in, you do the assessment, and then it's like money every month. There's money for the prescription, there's money for, and it can become a very large sum of money. People don't know they're getting into that, and that can cause real problems. Your focus, your bursary program for people on benefits, so where I think you said £54 a month, is a wonderful thing, and your other pricing is not so much. And I've certainly recommended people over to you for that reason. I think that it's a really great model. I know you're starting up an autism service shortly too, which I think it will be great. Obviously, we know there's a lot of crossover. I also wanted to share. So at 3 a.m, our feed went down.
Oh no!
I wasn't here. Poor Anna and Terry, who are our night team, had this realization, and very quickly we're able to resolve it. And there's a reason why we planned for this. So when we've been directing people, we direct them to the site, which has a live link, which takes you through. So it was always set up for this eventuality, because we have a single pipe in. We knew it was something that could happen. But one of the things that it then rendering is we get to see how many people between our start and 3 a.m. have come to visit us, and it's 4,400 people.
Oh, well done. Well done.
So
Congratulations.
that was the halfway point, roughly. So we are pretty excited about that. We were actually, I have to say, obviously it's been long now, I've got a little bit emotional, it's a big deal. And you've been a huge part of that. And I wanted to thank you so much for your involvement, for your support, for the work we're all trying to do together to change ADHD in this country, and the work you do every day for the people coming to you.
Henry, thank you. And it's humbling to hear those numbers and to hear your praise. May I make a suggestion? Take this away. Lisa and I will come back with you. We'll do a webinar specially to go through the Q&A, if you wish.
Oh, that would be wonderful.
We'll do a specific one that is completely patient-led by the Q&A, and we'll just rattle them off one evening and record it maybe for those in the
Well, that we'd love, because then we can put it in the site
Yeah.
and give people information. So
once you've had some sleep, and once you've got me in contact with Adrian Childs, just mention that again. Then Lisa and I.
Man is a deal maker.
Yeah, well,
Get stuff done.
I'm in business. We'll come back and we'll just specifically rattle through those Q&A to give people even more awareness than you've managed with 4,000 people over this 24-hour period. It'll be more by the time the 24 hours are up. Hats off to you and the team. Absolutely incredible. It's been a privilege to be part of this. It really has.
Well, you've been a big part of making it happen, so thank you very much. I've got to say adieu, but obviously we're running late again. I should not be allowed to be in charge of the clock. But honestly, it was very important to ask those particular questions. There are more important ones, and thank you for coming back to that. That's it. We say goodbye to you guys. Thank you again so much. Good luck with your days. And over to me in just my beautiful visage. We are going to... we're moving on. So the conference continues, as you just heard. At the halfway point, we've had 4,400 people join us. We're pretty excited about that. It's a big deal. Obviously, we're bringing ADHD together globally, learning from each other, helping each other, changing ADHD globally, nationally, locally, and individually. I came up with that line, and I like it.